Okay, the recording's going. Now I'm going to start the broadcast.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. This is Brooks Carter, and we're here with another Human Development and Leadership Division webinar. This is a repeat of Rip Stauffer's presentation of 2 weeks ago. We blew the tape. The NSA was not forthcoming in providing us a recording of the event, and so we decided to hold it again, figuring there would be some interest, and there are some people out there, and that's good. And Rip was gracious enough to agree to do it again. In thinking about our schedule, you may have noticed there are no subsequent webinars scheduled. I have a couple that are in development, but I'm sure there are some people in our audience who could very confidently present a webinar. This is a pretty high-level audience, and if you could, and if you'd like to, please get in touch with me. I think the easiest way to do it is my email would be plastered all over our website, which is www.asqhdandl.org, and let me know, and we'll work with you to develop something, because we have open space the rest of the year. I wanted a little vacation in the summer, and I got it. So that's it in the way of announcements. We've had a good year so far, and I'm sure somebody out there can add to it. As usual, you're on mute because there's no way to handle the number of people we've got here all being able to talk. When we have our division board meetings, we're pushing the limit with about 8 people, with interference and noise and somebody using a chainsaw in their office with their microphone on. So you can type questions into the system, and we will try to answer them. There'll be Q&A at the end, but sometimes we'll interrupt Rip if there's a question that demands that. You'll get a follow-up email after the webinar, which will award you your recertification units, and also will contain a little survey. I hope you'll answer it. It takes about 2 minutes, and it's helpful to us. And with that, I'll introduce Rip very briefly by saying his main qualification is that he can do a lot of stuff. He's a very, very experienced quality professional with a lot of certifications, but more importantly, he actually is an effective quality professional. He's a colleague of Bill, as the chair of our division right now, and comes highly recommended by Bill. Bill said he'd do a good webinar, and he did. And unfortunately, we didn't record it, so we're going to do it this time. And with that, I'll give you Rip. Fortunately, this is my chance to hear it because I wasn't there last time. I was traveling. So Rip, go ahead, and I'll be here to bother you.
Okay, thanks, Brooks. Your world is not red or green, and your dashboard shouldn't be either. I just want to open by saying that the references for this, the original reference was a visual display of quantitative information by Tufte, who really inspired the other 2 books, which are both by Stephen Few, Show Me the Numbers, Designing Tables and Graphs to Enlighten, and now you can see it, Simple Visualization Techniques for Quantitative Analysis. These are very well-researched books, a lot of ergonomics, human factors, psychology, cognitive psychology, and other things went into this. So they're really not playing around with these. They're very good references. Anybody who has to display data to anybody should probably have at least these 3 books in their library. Tufte has written a number of other works, and Few has a couple of books on dashboarding that are also very good. Why this presentation? Well, over the years I've done a lot of different projects, hundreds of projects in different organizations I've either mentored or done myself. I've sat through many presentations of data. I've helped put together many presentations of data. I've seen a lot of dashboard designs, and unfortunately a lot of the ones that I've seen haven't been very effective, either because of poor visualization, lack of understanding of the data themselves, or often there's just no consideration of what the users are seeing or what they might understand. That's one kind of big lesson from this is know your audience. But there's a lot of bad use of data, not just in presentations and not just in dashboards, but you see a lot of bad data hanging around on walls and on the internet. Some of it's ineffective, some of it's misleading, and some of it's actually harmful. And this next piece that I'm going to talk about is what really inspired this. A few years ago I started to notice a pretty dangerous trend. And here's an example. I was working as a master black belt and consultant for a large telecom organization, and one of the vice presidents that I worked for had a weekly meeting with all her direct reports. It happened every Thursday, and every Thursday it was kind of the weekly how goes it meeting. I'm sure you've all been to one of those. And they had this one indicator that they would always lead off with, and most of the discussion that followed was around this particular indicator. And here's how they showed it. This was a customer service metric. It wasn't actually CSM, that just stands for customer service metric, but basically what it was a sort of a net promoter score. And the net promoter score, any of you have any experience with net promoter scores, they usually go from 1 to 10. And what this is the percentage of people who answered either 9 or 10 to this one particular customer service question that this particular division cared about. You can see that this week they had 28.01. That was a little above the target of 28.0%. Month to date was, for this particular week, was 27.57, so it was a little under the target, and year to date was 27.62, so that was a little under the target. But everybody was pretty happy with the 28.01 because, hey, they made the target that week, so you know, we passed out t-shirts and mugs and everybody congratulated each other on making the target for that week. So I had a big sigh of relief because management's eye wasn't on them for the next few days. The following week, though, we ended up at 27.83, and for that 0.18 difference in the percentage of people who were answering 9 or 10 on this particular net promoter score, of course, there was much wailing and gnashing of teeth, and everybody trying to figure out what happened, why did it go wrong, we're heading in the wrong direction here, what can we do to turn it around. I don't really care for this, and the reason I don't really care for it is partially from my upbringing. When I was a kid, I was a kid a long time ago, we used to work on cars in the yard. We were shade tree mechanics. My dad was a mechanical engineer, and he always worked on cars, and we rebuilt some cars together. And cars back in those days, and even some of them today, had gauges so that you could tell what your oil pressure was. You could tell, you know, how your battery was charging and things like that. It was always a good idea to be able to look at these gauges and see how your engine was performing. Somewhere along the way, it just got to be too complicated, I guess, for people to read gauges. So they replaced them with lights. And now you don't really know what's going to happen until it happens, but once it happens, you pretty much have to pull over to the side of the road and call AAA or whoever. And I picked up a term from my dad for these lights. My dad and most of his friends, and eventually myself and most of my friends, ended up calling them idiot lights. The idea being that, you know, they were for people who weren't smart enough to read gauges. Now, I don't want to say that every one of these red and green dashboards is an idiot light, but I think it's a pretty fitting metaphor. There's a reason for them, though. I mean, you can't really blame some managers for wanting to have a very simple way to tell when things are happening. In 2011, a study by EMC Corporation found that our information was doubling every 2 years, and they estimated that 1.8 million zettabytes would be created and replicated in 2011. That's enough for 200 billion HD movies, or it would fill enough iPads to build the Great Wall of China twice the height of the original, or build a mountain of iPads 25 times higher than Mount Fuji. So, you know, we're just cranking out a lot of data. That was 2011. Every minute in 2012, it created 571 new websites. The web picked up 217 new users. YouTube users uploaded 48 hours of video every minute on average in 2012. Email users sent 200 million messages. Google received 2 million search queries a minute. Facebook users shared over 680,000 items. Flickr and Instagram users added over 6,600 new photos. That's every minute in 2012, every minute. I don't know, it's staggering to me. Bloggers, 27,778 new posts just on Tumblr. Apple got 47,000 app downloads, and Twitter users sent over 100,000 tweets every single minute in 2012. That was 2012. In 2013, a study by IBM estimated that 90% of all the data existing in the world had been generated within the past 2 years. And with numbers like these, it's not hard to see that that would be true. So we're up to our eyeballs in data. We've got more data than we know what to do with. So you can't really fault managers sometimes for wanting a simple way to try to get access to it, but it's just done very poorly in a lot of cases. I had a manager at a bank that I worked for tell me that he had over 5,000 meaningful metrics that he checked every day. I didn't believe him. By the end of the week, he had 5 that he really knew were meaningful and he actually could check every day and use to manage better. So what do we need? Well, there are a few things. We have to have a way to make sense of the data. There's all this data, and if the data are good, and in many cases they're not, and most of you probably have had some big data horror story that you can tell due to lack of common operational definitions and a lot of other reasons, a lot of the big data is not really very clean data. We need to recognize a few things. Data plus analysis equals information. Data are just observations. You need good analysis to make them informative. And if you add display to that, you can actually use them for communication. The goals should be understanding and better decisions for managers. The purpose of analysis is not to confound managers, to confuse the enumerate, or anything like that. It's not for math practice. The purpose of analysis is insight. Should be, always has been, probably always should be. There are some facts, and this is some of the stuff from Stephen Few. We don't attend to everything we see. Visual perception is very selective. And our eyes are drawn to familiar patterns. We see what we know and we see what we expect. So we're looking for patterns when we look at things. And one important thing, one important discovery that Few and Tufte and others have found from human factors and psychology research is that memory plays an important role in human cognition. But working memory is very, very limited, and we use working memory when we're attempting to decipher and interpret what we see on the screen, what we see in a presentation. And this is an example from Few about this whole concept of working memory. There are probably a few people online here who are looking at this and immediately see the difference, but I know almost certainly that most of you have been staring at this now for probably 10 seconds and still haven't caught the difference. And there are people who can look at this for several minutes, and I looked at for a couple of minutes myself and then looked at the key because I didn't have any more minutes to waste trying to figure it out. It's a little easier to see if you do it this way. This was the left-hand photo, and this is the right-hand photo. So if I shift back and forth, I mean, it's pretty easy to see the left and right at the top change, right? It's that thing behind that bunch of bushes behind the Sphinx. And now that you've seen it, of course, you can't unsee it, so it's very easy to see in the dual picture, but I know that there were some of you who couldn't see it before. And this is sort of the point about this working memory, is that it holds a very limited amount of information. So when you're making comparisons on graphs, when you're making comparisons, you have to make them very easy to see, because working memory only lets you look at a little bit of the screen at a time and try to make sense of it. There are some traits, though. The few calls them pre-attentive traits. We don't have to think about them to see them. They're perceived before we even know that we've perceived them. Our minds just pick them up without even having to think about them at all. Some of those attributes include length. So I'm almost certain that everybody, as soon as I showed this, could see that the fourth bar there was a little bit shorter. Thickness, of course the third bar is thicker. Orientation, the second bar is just a little bit off kilter. And vertical space, or where things are in space. You can see that the first three dots are sort of in a line, in a rough line, and the fourth dot falls a little bit off of that line. Size, when we look at all these circles, we can easily see just a small difference in size. Shape, if you highlight something, it shows up. These are all things you can see without thinking about them. It never gets to your brain, really. It doesn't get much past your brain stem. If I blur one of the objects, it pops out. If I change color on it, it pops out. And if I just even just gray it out, it doesn't even have to be a different color, just a different shade of gray. These are all attributes that are very useful to us when we try to display data. There are some that are even more useful, though, especially when we're trying to display quantitative data, when we're trying to display small differences in numbers. Two of these traits are a little better than the others, and it's these two. For real precision with quantitative measures, we can see differences with these two particular pre-attentive attributes much better than we can with almost everything else. Longer being greater and higher or farther to the right being greater. So this makes a lot of difference when we're looking at time series data and when we're looking at data in bar charts. It really makes it a big difference in how we do things. For instance, here's a graph I found somewhere. This is comparisons across categories, sales by region. And you can see that the blue, the Northeast is the largest sector, has the most sales, and maybe the red one, the West Coast, has maybe the next most sales. Southeast and Midwest look about the same. Southwest and Deep South look about the same, and Hawaii and Alaska looks like the smallest. But for those ones that are pretty much the same, there's not a lot of precision there. You can tell that they're different if you look at them long enough, but if you start adding a lot more categories, pie charts become even less useful. It's much more useful to look at categorical data like this in a bar chart. This is a Pareto chart with the cumulative percentage line removed. So we can see sales by region, and it's very easy to see in this graph from the same data how the sales fell out that year. West Coast is clearly higher than the Southeast, not a whole lot higher, but clearly higher. And this is what I mean by precision in looking at graphs that show quantitative data, is that we can see very small differences readily when we look at them in a bar chart. They're not so readily discernible in a pie graph. Here's another bad pie chart. One of my favorites. I teach a class in database decision making for Walden University, and it seems like every time I ask for a bad graph, at least one of my students finds this one. What was the best part of the Super Bowl, yes or no? Here's a bad bar chart. And this doesn't look necessarily like a bad bar chart. When you first glance at it, it looks, like clearly the bar on the right, the top tax rate on the right, is many times that of the bar on the left. But what makes it a bad bar chart is, with a bar chart, you really got to pin the scale to 0. You can't just show the tops of the bars. Ross Perot made these charts pretty popular when he was running for president. Here's a better bar chart of the same data, and now you can see, yes, there is a difference, and certainly there is a difference, but it's not a dramatic difference like this. This is a misleading bar chart. Here's a chart. I always laugh when I see this chart because I can't help but think that at some point, somewhere in time, somebody put this chart up in front of a bunch of executives and said, as you can clearly see from this chart, and I have no idea what followed that because there's not much that you can clearly see from this chart. It's just a bad chart all around, using bars for time series, spreading the years across the months like that, putting these numbers in. I think we finally figured out what these numbers were, maybe the last time we did this webinar. But then they've got numbers up in the corner. It's just, there's too much junk in this chart, and it just doesn't mean a whole lot. It's too hard to discern any information from it. So what about time series? If we're going to talk about time series, the thing we want to do is discover trends, to look at behavior over time, because we want to try to predict. In time series data analysis, what we're trying to do is what Deming called analytic studies. We are trying to take the past and predict what's going to happen in the future. We're extrapolating from what went before to what's going to happen in the future. And as with everything else, there are good ways to do this and there are bad ways to do it. One thing to remember is that working memory can only hold so much. So when you're trying to interpret trends in a time series, well, this is one way to do it, and I've seen people do this. So they'll put 2010 on the top and 2009 on the bottom, or maybe they might even change it. And you can sort of discern the trends. At least for 2009, you can see that it was fairly stable. Because 2010, the tops of the bars on 2010 are all dependent on where the bars from 2009 are. 2010 is a little harder to read. You can take your time and probably figure it out over time, but you've just sort of defeated your purpose by stacking these bars this way. Another way is you could put the years side by side like this, and this is a little bit easier to read than the stacked bars, but still you've got a trend going over 2 years, or a trend you're trying to analyze that goes over 2 years. Why confuse it by sticking them together? It's a little clearer if you spread them out so that you can actually see what happened over the 2 years, month by month over the 2 years. But this is a waste of ink. And because we've got the scale pinned to 0, as it should be with a bar chart, we're just sort of looking at the tops of these bars. Most of the space in this graph is going to waste. What we need is a way for our eye to just follow the trend. And so a simple line graph turns out to be the best display we can have for a time series, because the eye wants to follow that line, and this turns everything into one chunk of data. We can see what's happening very quickly over time. The scale's not pinned to 0 anymore, so the chart is more sensitive and makes it easier to spot little differences from month to month over the 2-year time period. I've heard people say, well, we can look at tables. We could just look at tables. Can't we just look at the tables? We could put the numbers in tables, and surely people can read the numbers in tables. And that's true. They can read the numbers in tables. And yes, you could figure everything out that you could figure out looking at this by looking at this. But it takes you a while. And one of the reasons it takes you a while is that we have to deal with working memory. And working memory can only hold 2 or 3, maybe some people who are very good can hold 4 or 5 chunks of data in their heads at one time for working memory to make comparisons and things. So if I'm trying to compare operator 1 to operator 2, I could compare 16 to 8.2 and 15.3 to 8.4, and over time I would see that, yes, certainly every month it looks like the bottom value is larger than the top one, but I have to take each of those as a chunk. If I'm looking at this, I can probably keep that 14.6, 16.5, and 12.3 in my head as I try to compare it to something else. If I add 2 more operators, now it becomes a whole lot more complex. Now it'll take me a long time to figure out who's ahead here, who's higher, who's lower over time. I can tell in any given month, I can look across those and keep all 4 of those chunks together at any particular time period here. But to look across and see if there are trends going across the whole thing, it's just too hard with a table. For the first comparison with the operator in 1 and 2,
can you hear me?
yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, anybody who does anything with data, if they gave you that table, what would you do? You'd draw a graph.
Sure, yeah. But you'd be surprised how many people, I've even heard people say, well, it's in our culture. We're just used to tables. Why are you making us draw graphs?
I would find, and I've spent many years with tons of data, and I would find it impossible to work with that table. I would have to graph it.
Well, I would too.
Yeah.
I would too. But you'd be surprised at how many managers have told me, well, I just assume to see the table. I don't need anybody to make it for me.
It's a signal that they're not appreciating the data very much.
Right. I just don't think they've ever really seen a good graph. They've probably seen a lot of stacked bars and things like that real estate graph that I showed. The nice thing about just throwing it in a line graph like this is now I can easily see operator 1 and operator 2 and exactly what they've been doing over the last, whatever these 20 time periods were, days or hours, at least looks like hours. And the reason for that is that these are just 2 chunks. I've turned those tables that had 20 chunks in each line, so that was 40 chunks of data altogether. I've turned it into just 2 chunks that I can easily compare now. They're very, very distinctive. If I add more operators, well, it gets a little more complex, but it's still easier to see than that table. Putting it on a bar graph again, I just want to reiterate this. Bar graphs are just bad for time series. So here I've got it on bar graph with a different color for each operator. What can you tell from this? That the operators are leaving a very colorful trace. Is about all you can really tell. Maybe you can see what I mean by a waste of ink. No help to stack them. I've never met a stack bar chart that I liked yet. I have yet to have anybody send me one that I couldn't find a much better graph for. This certainly isn't any help. Now if I put it in a different view, instead of stacking all the operators on top of each other, I set them aside in a different, each one's got their own piece of the time series. I've actually, each one's got the same time series, but I've just broken it up into 4 pieces. So now I can see even better who's doing what. That operator 1, if down is good, if this is cycle time and down is good, then operator 1 has a lower cycle time than all the others. Adding different symbols maybe helps a little bit. I don't really need them, but it does help me to discern the operators. Putting some color on it is also helpful. Now I can see them, tell them apart a little bit better. Again, even changing them, even putting them in color and setting them side by side as I did with the line graphs, you can see this just isn't as easy to read as this is. It's not as easy to spot the trends, and it's a waste of ink. So this is clearer, but clearer still is our old friend, the control chart, the process behavior chart. Because here now I have cycle time by operator. This is an individual value and moving range chart. And now I can get some sense of not only who's doing better, but whether they're doing significantly better. Because this is kind of like a one-way ANOVA if you think about it. If I just draw a line through the top control limit, the upper control limit for operator 3, operator 4 has some points above that line. And what that means is that operator 4 is significantly different, statistically significantly different than operator 3. Those 3 points there tell me that without any doubt. I can also draw a line through the bottom, the lower control limit of operator 3, and I can see that operator 2 has no points below that line, so operator 2 is not significantly different from operator 3. But operator 1 has all these points that are below the line. In fact, operator 1's got a special cause on the lower end anyway. So now I can actually get a sense of what's significantly different. Let's go back to tables for just a minute, because I want to skip to another issue for a second. This is an example from Don Wheeler. And Wheeler was asked one time to come speak to the CEO of a company about database decision making. And when they were meeting, the CEO said, well, we use data. And Don said, well, could you show me what you do with it? And he said, well, sure. Here's one of our reports. So he pulled out some quarterly reports, and this is what they looked at when they, quote, use data to make decisions. And I've done this with a lot of boardrooms, and a lot of boardrooms say, well, we do this. And it's really, you know, you can't blame them. It's kind of driven by Wall Street. Everybody likes this quarter, last quarter, and this quarter, same quarter last year. They love those comparisons. So that's what they would look at. Every quarter they'd get together, and so region A was 17.6% up from last quarter, which was very good, and 20.6% up from last year, same quarter last year. That was very good. So they got 4 stars, and everybody passed out T-shirts and coffee mugs and posters, and everybody was happy. And then Region E, poor Region E, they were off by 19.7% from last quarter and off by 22% from last year. So, you know, they were told to take a round turn, that they were heading in the wrong direction and that they needed to get better. Well, there's an old saying among statisticians that any fool can make a trend out of 2 points. And that's exactly what they were doing, and they were assigning essentially the same thing that we would see today. This particular example came from before we had red, green, and yellow, but this is about how it would shake out on a stoplight type dashboard. The 3 at the top would get greens, the 2 at the bottom would be red, and region F would get a caution. So let's take one of these bad regions. Let's take region D, which wasn't too bad really. And you know, the summary that we get here is these 2-point fools trends from last quarter to now and from last year to now. And they're not too bad. It looked kind of flat, a little bit off from last year, but definitely down from last quarter. So this was clearly a bad quarter for region D. But the danger in these 2-point trends, and the danger in only trying to manage your business with quarterly numbers in isolation like this, is that it ignores what happens over time. This is what's really going on here. The quarterly sales for region D, when you put them on a control chart, show you that there is a significant upward trend. I mean, this is 5 years worth of data. 5 years ago, they were down below the lower control limit. Now they're almost entirely above the upper control limit. And if you want to do a trended control chart, a trended process behavior chart, which you can also do, you can see that really for the last 5 years they've been in control on an upward trend. Sales have been growing for Region D. You'd never know that by looking at those 2-point Fool's trends and staring at that table. You would never find that out because you'd see that table this quarter and you'd see a different one next quarter. Next quarter, Region D might look better. You'd never detect this 13.7 units a quarter that they're actually significantly growing over time and predictably growing over time. So, back to this red-green thing again. I don't like them because they're idiot lights, but I don't like them because they drive sort of bad behavior as well. I mean, every week we would talk about, you know, what a great thing this was that we got a green, or what a bad thing it was that we got a red. Now, I wouldn't talk about that. In fact, most of these same direct reports and that vice president came to a meeting the next day with me every week. We had a Six Sigma meeting every Friday. And after the first one of these that I went to, and the first one of these that I saw, I asked the vice president if she had data going back a couple of years, and she said, yeah. I said, well, can I get a year or two? And she said, sure. So she sent me the data, and the next morning I showed them a slightly different display. I showed them this. This is the real story. This was their weekly score, and it had been for 2 years. It had been completely stable. Almost perfect statistical control. Well, almost perfect statistical control. Nothing had moved. Nothing had changed in the last 2 years. Everything had been exactly the same. And you can see here that the X bar, the average, is 26.78. Now, some genius in upper management had decided, well, we can give them a target of 28. They ought to be able to hit that. Well, that person clearly never saw this graph. Because to put a target there where you're almost straddling the average is almost guaranteeing that most of the time you're going to be below your target, unless you're willing to actually make some kind of a change to move it. So setting a goal of 28 was probably not a real rational act. What I told them every Friday, and it took a couple of months, but every Friday I would kind of show them this picture and say, you know, this is the real story. This is what's going on with this weekly score that you're worried about. And what this says is that most of the time, a little more than half of the time anyway, you're going to be red. You can count on it. You can bet on that, and it's going to happen every time because there are just a lot more of these red dots than there are green ones. You've got your target just above your process average. So we can confidently predict much wailing and gnashing of teeth without some significant management action. I even ran them a process capability, a capability study to show that overall about 64% of the time they're going to be in the red. 65 weeks out of 100, I think, was how I put it to them. And I told them this every week for, as I said, probably 2 months. It was at least 6 weeks. And then every week I would show them this. Thursday we'd look at the red-green thing. Friday morning I would show them the control chart. And they would look at it and they would say, oh, well, thanks for all that analysis, Rip. That was very informative. And then finally, after about 2 months, one of the managers finally said, well, wait a minute. What are you actually saying here? Are you saying that none of this stuff that we're doing is doing any good? And I showed him the control chart again and said, yeah, pretty much. I mean, you're sort of nibbling around the edges here. What we really need is some kind of an actual project that's going to look at this and go into some root cause analysis and find out why the customers aren't responding better than they are, and try to do something about that. And until you do something about that, it's going to continue to look just like this. So to their credit, they did start a project, and we did get it much better. In fact, we got it up to where the lower control limit was above that 28. So that pretty much solved that problem. Of course, next year another management genius set it just above the average that we had attained. But that's just going to happen, I guess. So for 2 years, the system had been stable. They'd had top net weekly promoter scores from 17 to 36%, closer to 27% than farther away. Without action, they'd continue to see about 65 weeks out of 100 with a red indicator. So, you know, how useful is this red-green dashboard? It certainly didn't help that company at all. I'm not going to say, though, that it's never, ever, ever useful to have that kind of an indicator. I'm just going to say that most of us live in a world, most managers who manage processes live in a world where it's not. Now, if you happen to be one of those people, because this is one of the arguments I get a lot when I talk about this is, well, you know, if you're in a nuclear facility and you've got 1,000 gauges to look at, you can't possibly look at all the gauges. You need to know when something's changing really quickly. And if you're in that situation, then by all means, you know, have that as a backup. But the first thing that somebody in a nuclear plant does when a red light goes off like that is go to that gauge and find out what's really happening. And the red light comes on before it gets dangerous too.
Yeah, Ralph.
So that's all the slides I have.
Ralph, a comment on the prior chart. I include this in my writing because when I was initially a sales manager, I did exactly that. The salesman whose sales had gone up, I called and said good work, and the salesman whose sales had gone down, I'd call up and say, how can we help? What do we need to do? And it's a big waste of time. It's a harmful process when you have it. In other words, it's not neutral and it's not ineffective. It causes a huge waste of time and causes the sales manager to think he's doing a good job because what's going to happen is the people who went down will probably go up with regression to the mean and vice versa.
That's right. Punishment works better than reward.
I had another comment when you were showing the things that register and the things that don't. You know, the length. Well, there's a recent book by Daniel Kahneman. And he basically have two systems that thinking. System one, which is not conscious, which makes a lot of your decisions and which is very fast and is the part of your brain that recognizes those things. And it recognizes a lot more than that. I was hoping Marilyn had my slide of an angry face, and you can flash this face for a half a second and people know it's an angry person. Right. That's all system one. System two, you know, takes the table and converts it into a control chart. But many people operate almost entirely off of system one, and even highly educated people operate frequently off of system one system one can be wrong. It's wrong a lot, but I commend anybody who is interested in psychology to read Kahneman's book. It's
fast and slow.
Yes, thinking fast and slow. I consider it the most useful book ever written about psychology, maybe the only useful book ever written about psychology. I'm kind of a critic, but that's what's going on with those lines. Kahneman deals with that a lot in his book, with length and so on.
Yeah, he also points out in there that statistical thinking is not an easy thing to learn to do. No. Statisticians will have their system one kick in and say ridiculous things that they would never say if they thought about it statistically, but they miss it. Marilyn, do we have any questions? I found that really interesting, by the way. Well, thanks.
So the book, someone asked the name of the book title. Again, it's Thinking Fast and Slow.
And it's Kahneman is spelled Kahnemann.
Anyone who has any questions should type them in the question box, please.
Kahneman was the first psychologist to win a Nobel Prize, incidentally. He won it in economics because there is no Nobel Prize in psychology, but his work was clearly psychology.
Yeah.
Which the Nobel
But it
Committee
really shook
understood.
up the world of economics.
Oh, absolutely.
Because what he was able to show was that all those economic models were bad.
Right, economics is based on rational decisions, and he's got a whole book about how irrational decisions get made.
Yeah.
There's another guy who writes about the same thing, who's some think is more readable. His guy's name is Daniel Airley.
Oh yeah.
He's at MIT and Kahneman's at Princeton.
Yeah, my son introduced me to Airley.
Yeah, his book
good too.
His book is predictably irrational.
Yep. Did you ever read Marilyn Vos Savant's book?
No.
No, I can't think of the name of it right now, but I'll send it to you. She writes a column for the Parade magazine, and she's the one many years ago who, back in the early 90s or late 80s, brought the whole Monty Hall dilemma out because somebody sent her. She's got the highest recorded IQ of anybody, I guess, so she writes this column in Parade magazine, and somebody had asked her about the Monty Hall dilemma, and she triggered a firestorm. She'd never gotten more than 10 or 15 letters in a week, and she suddenly started getting sacks of mail, a lot of them from professors in endowed chairs of mathematics at major technical universities who were telling her she was wrong, and she wasn't.
I have another question here. It says, what about colors for takeaway boxes? How important do you think they are?
Well, I mean, I think anything that's going to draw attention to something that you're trying to draw attention to is helpful for takeaway boxes and presentations. You've got to be careful, though, because it's often we take a lot of things for granted. I mean, this red-green thing takes a lot of things for granted. I've had any number of classes where I had at least one or two students in the classes who couldn't see red or green. So it would be meaningless to them anyway. But yeah, I mean, color is a pre-attentive attribute, and it can be used with great effect. It's just if that's all you're relying on for good or bad, and you're not looking at the underlying data, then you're kind of back to idiot lights. But certainly if you're using it to call attention to a takeout or a takeaway box, that's probably, there's nothing wrong with that. That's just good presentation skill.
Any other questions out there, Marilyn?
No, I think that's it.
Well,
okay,
we can close down. And I think I got 2 tapes because I recorded it on 2 computers. And I'd like to thank everybody. And if nobody raises their hand, we'll end the webinar. Maybe people could raise their hand if they enjoyed Rip's talk. There's a hand raising machine on the
And we have all sorts of hands raised.
Oh,
cool.
Yeah. Good.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for an informative session. Great talk.
Thanks.
I'm going to click the little
Take
button.
care, everyone.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. I'm going to click the little button in the corner and we'll all be gone.